الهدى يا شهر الندى.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه الطيبين الطاهرين. We start with the name of Allah. We praise and thank Allah for all of the endowments He bestowed without Allah being obligated to give anything. And we ask Allah to raise the rank of Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam, and the ranks of his wives, believing relatives, companions, and those who followed them sincerely until Judgment Day. And we ask Allah to protect the nation of Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam from what the Prophet feared for his nation. In the last lesson, we were mentioning the book of the summary of Sheikh Abdullah, and we covered some conditions for following the Imam. Among them, that the follower would not precede the Imam in the standing position, nor in the saying of Allahu Akbar, and that the follower would not go ahead of his Imam by two long intervals, action intervals, or to fall behind the Imam by two long action intervals. The author continued saying, lagging behind the Imam by more than three long physical intervals invalidates the follower's prayer, even if they have an excuse. Thus, if the follower, for example, had a slower recitation, he needed to recite slower so that he could recite properly, and the Imam went ahead of him, thus he lagged behind the Imam for two long intervals of action. Because of this excuse, the follower's prayer would not be invalidated. However, if the follower lagged behind the Imam by more than three long intervals of action, then the prayer of the follower would be invalidated, even if he had an excuse for his lagging behind. An example of that is for the Imam to bow, stand, make al-i'tidal, go down, prostrate, sit up between the two prostrations, prostrate a second time, and then either stand completely for the following rak'ah or sit up for the tashahhud, whether the first or the second, while the follower is still in the standing of reciting al-Fatiha. Thus, when the Imam reached that standing or sitting position, if the follower does not leave his own order and become in unison with the Imam, then the follower's prayer would be invalidated. Thus, if this occurred and the Imam went ahead of the follower by this number of intervals, and he was in the second prostration, and he started to come up from that second prostration to either sit or stand, then if he was going to sit, the follower would leave his recitation of al-Fatiha, stop it, and then sit down to join and be in unison with the Imam. And if the Imam was going to stand up for the following rak'ah, then the follower would remain standing. However, he would change his intention and intend to pray with the Imam in the Imam's current rak'ah, meaning he was praying one rak'ah, now the Imam is going into the following rak'ah, so he intends to pray with the Imam in that following rak'ah. And he would not be obligated or required to repeat his recitation of al-Fatiha from the beginning. Rather, he can continue from where he was already at, the amount of progress that he already made, until the end of the verse. Then the author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, said, hence, if the follower stays behind to finish reciting the Fatiha, after the Imam completes ruku', the bowing, and two prostrations, and sits for the tashahhud, or stands up for the following cycle, then the ma'mum stops reciting the Fatiha and must be in unison with the Imam and perform one cycle after the closing salam of the Imam. Yes, since he did not complete that rak'ah. Since the follower did not complete that rak'ah, rather he left his recitation, he didn't bow, he didn't make an i'tidal, he didn't make the 2 prostrations. Rather, he left his own order to be in unison with the imam so that his prayer would not be invalidated. Then, after the imam says the salam to finish his prayer, the follower would not say the salam after him to finish his prayer immediately. Rather, he would stand up again and perform an additional rak'ah to make up for that rak'ah that he did not complete. He said, however, if the ma'mum, the follower, finishes reciting the Fatiha before this, that is, before the imam precedes them by more than 3 long physical intervals, the ma'mum continues in the order of their own prayer. Yes, if the ma'mum, the follower, completed reciting the Fatiha before the imam went ahead of him by more than 3 long intervals of action, then in this case, the ma'mum would continue his own order, thus bowing, making an i'tidal, standing up after bowing, and going back to the position he was in before bowing, going back to the position he was in before bowing, then prostrating, sitting between the 2 prostrations, prostrating a second time, etc., until he catches up with the imam. And he would be mindful to observe the tuma'nina, the stillness in the different positions, etc. The follower continued mentioning conditions for following the imam: for one to know the movements of one's imam. Thus, if one did not know the movements of one's imam, then they would not be allowed to follow them. Their following of the imam would be invalid. And there are numerous ways for one to know the moves of their imam, like for them to see their imam, the imam's right in front of them, for example, or for them to hear the imam by hearing the imam go from position to position by him saying Allahu Akbar, for example, Sami Allahu liman hamida, etc., and follow the imam that way. Or if he couldn't see the imam or hear the imam with his voice without some type of system or device to help him, then even if he heard the imam's voice over a speaker, for example, that will be sufficient. Likewise, if he couldn't see the imam, but he sees who sees the imam, then likewise his following would be valid. So if there were many rows in the prayer and a person in the latter rows didn't see the imam, still he's linked to the imam by the rows in front of him. He sees who's in front of him, and they see who's in front of them, and they see the imam, for example. So then his prayer would still be valid, because that's how he would know the movements of his imam. There are other ways also, like for there to be a muballigh, a person who repeats some of the expressions of the imam, so that those who are far behind, who may not be able to hear the imam, can know the moves of the imam, etc. He said, and among the conditions for following the imam is to be with one's imam in a mosque, that is a masjid, or else within 300 cubits. So, if a follower was in the mosque with his imam and all the other conditions were met, so he knew the moves of his imam, etc., then there's no maximum distance that could be between the two for the follower's prayer to be valid in following the imam. And if there was a mile, for example, between the imam and the follower, however, the follower knew the moves of his imam, and they were both inside of a mosque, then the follower's prayer would still be valid because they're in the mosque. And the mosque is different than a musalla, so just be mindful of that in what we mean as a mosque or a masjid, being a place that was made waqf for the prayer. That is, it has this specific religious judgment. Someone made it waqf, giving it the judgment of what some refer to as religious charitable trust. And so it becomes a masjid this is what we're talking about, not just a place that people happen to pray and gather and have lessons that has not been made waqf. Then in that case, the rules of being outside of the masjid would apply because they're not in reality inside of a masjid. He said, or else within 300 cubits. So whoever was not within a masjid, the imam and the follower together, then the follower should not be distant from his imam by more than 300 cubits. A cubit is approximately 1.5 feet. So 300 cubits is about 450 feet approximately. And that's a significant amount of space. A football field is about 300 feet. So you're thinking a football field and a half. That's about 300 cubits. So if the follower knew the moves of his imam and the other conditions were met, and he was even 200 cubits away, which is about 300 feet, or even 300 cubits away, but not more, then his following would be valid. Following that imam would be valid. This is for what occurs outside of the mosque. However, if there was an imam, and then there was a row behind him that was within 300 cubits, and then there was a row behind them which was within 300 cubits from the row ahead of them, and then there was a row behind them, and they were within 300 cubits of the one ahead of him, and so on and so on, and these rows continue going back to the extent that the people in the last row were more than 300 cubits from the imam. Then still their prayer will be valid because they're linked to the imam by the rows ahead of them, and no row is more than 300 cubits away from the row ahead of it. So that would still be, that's the situation where the prayer of those people who were in the last row, even if they were a mile away from the imam, would still be valid. He said, not to have any barrier between the follower and the imam, which prevents the follower from reaching the imam. Yes, this would be invalid. So in the Shafi'i school, what some people do in their mosques and prayer areas of having the women in a separate room, and there's no clear pathway through to the imam without some barrier blocking, would be invalid. Barriers being like a wall, for example, or a glass wall, or a closed door. This in the Shafi'i school would not be valid. Rather, there needs to be a way for the follower to reach the imam without some blocking barrier of that type. He said, among the conditions for following the imam is the prayer format of both the follower and the imam must agree. Hence, it is invalid for the performer of the daily obligatory prayer, which contains bowing and prostration, to follow the performer of the funeral prayer, which contains no bowing and prostration. So that's what we mean, that the prayer format of the follower must match the prayer format of the imam. That is, when it comes to bowing and prostration. So it's not necessary that they must be praying the same exact prayer. Rather, that the formats of both prayers must agree. That's what is important here for the validity. So even if one person was praying an obligatory prayer and another was praying an optional prayer, whether it was the imam who was praying the obligatory prayer or the imam who was praying the optional prayer and the follower was praying the other type of prayer, or even if they were praying prayers of one was praying the current prayer and another was praying the makeup prayer, or if one was praying a prayer that had one number of cycles and another was praying a prayer with a lesser number of cycles, for example, then it still would be valid for one to follow the other. Still would be valid for one to follow the other. So it's not that they have to be the exact same prayer, but that their formats have to agree when it comes to the bowing and prostration. That's why It's not valid for a person who's praying one of the 5 daily prayers, which includes bowing and prostration, to follow the one who's praying the funeral prayer, because it has none of those. Then he said, both the imam and the follower must not disagree enormously with each other in a recommended act, meaning that the follower would not disagree enormously with the imam in a recommended sunnah aspect of the prayer. He said that whether by doing it or leaving it out, like sitting for the last tashahhud. So here he's saying that the follower should not disagree in something that's considered an enormous disagreement with his imam in a recommended sunnah aspect of the prayer. When he said like sitting for the tashahhud, this is an example of if the imam left out the tashahhud, then left out the sitting for the first tashahhud, which is optional in the prayers that have more than 2 rak'ah, like Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, and Isha. Sitting for after the second rak'ah to recite the tashahhud and the salah on the Prophet is a recommended and rewardable act, but it's not an integral of the prayer. Thus, if one abandoned the first tashahhud in this scenario, their prayer would still be valid, although they wouldn't get the maximum reward. If the imam abandoned the first tashahhud, and so after completing the final prostration in the second rak'ah, he stood back up, then it's prohibited for the follower to disagree with him in an enormous disagreement by remaining seated and reciting the tashahhud for himself. Rather, in this scenario, he would abandon the tashahhud and follow the imam, or he would break off from the imam and pray independently and then perform the tashahhud. If he didn't and he sat for the tashahhud while the imam abandoned it, then his prayer, the prayer of the follower in that case, would be invalidated. And an example of the imam doing something and the follower leaving it out that would invalidate the prayer is if the imam prostrated the sahw prostration, the sujood of forgetfulness, or the sujood of the prostration of forgetting. So if, for example, the imam made an error in his prayer, he mistakenly added an integral of action, for example, or he was going to leave something out and then was corrected, for example, or even if it was an optional matter like leaving out the qunut supplication after raising up for al-i'tidal in the second rak'ah of the Fajr prayer, for example. And then because of that, the imam made the sujood of as-sahw, the sujood of forgetfulness, at the end of the prayer. If the follower remained following the imam but left out performing the sujood of forgetfulness, then the prayer of the follower would be invalidated. Then finally, the author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, said, the follower must intend to follow the imam while saying the opening statement, Allahu Akbar, in the Jumu'ah prayer. This is because the Jumu'ah prayer is a prayer that is only prayed in congregation. So it's a condition, it's necessary for the follower to make the intention of praying in congregation with the saying of Allahu Akbar. In other prayers that are valid when prayed alone and in congregation, it's not necessary for the follower to make the intention of praying in congregation while he's saying Allahu Akbar. Rather, he's allowed to make the intention for the prayer that he's praying, say Allahu Akbar, and then after entering into the prayer that way, then make the intention to follow the imam or pray in congregation. He said, in other prayers, this intention must occur before following the imam in his moves, after a long wait for the imam to move. So basically you have three matters. You have one, to not intend to follow the imam. However, meaning that he's not joining in with the imam praying in congregation with him. However, he intentionally follows the moves of the imam, not bowing until he bows, not standing up until he stands up, not prostrating until he prostrates, while waiting a long wait for the imam. For example, he waits for the imam a long wait for him to bow, then he bows. Then he waits for the imam a long wait for him to stand up, then he stands up, for example. If these three matters occur, the prayer of the follower would be invalidated. So we have him not intending to follow the imam while following the moves of his imam, waiting a long wait to follow those moves. However, if any one of these three matters was not present, then the prayer of the follower would not be invalidated. For example, if he intended to follow the imam before following him after a long wait, then his prayer would not be invalidated. Or if, for example, he didn't intend to follow the imam, join along with him in his prayer, but he didn't follow his moves. Rather, he just went at his own pace without following the moves of the imam. When the imam bowed, he didn't bow, for example, or the like, then likewise his prayer would not be invalidated. Or if he didn't intend to follow the imam, nor did he, and he followed the moves of the imam, but not after a long wait. He didn't wait a long wait to follow the moves of the imam, rather as if their prayers were being performed at a similar pace. So when the imam bowed, he bowed, but not because he was waiting for the imam to bow. Rather, that's just when he was going to bow, because he's praying at the same speed as him. Then when the imam rose up after bowing, he rose up after bowing, but not because he was waiting a long wait for the imam to raise up after bowing. Rather, because that's when he was going to raise up, because he was praying at a similar pace. Then, likewise, the prayer of the follower would not be invalidated. And Allah Ta'ala knows best. God willing, in the next class, we'll mention some additional conditions for following the imam. May Allah Ta'ala bless myself and you. Alhamdulillah wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.
يا شهر الخيرات والإحسان والبركات يا رمضان